Today is a very momentous day. Reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, after struggling for so many years, Srila Prabhupada today will be inaugurating his first disciples in New York City, and just 2 days after that he'll be performing the first marriage ceremony in ISKCON. We'll be hearing, as Satsvarup Maharaj, his team collected memoirs from all of Prabhupada's disciples and devotees who had personal association with Srila Prabhupada. And that went on for quite a few years. And this volume 2 was the first volume that Satsvarup Maharaj printed, because he was personally present for all of it. Volume 1 was going to take many more years of research, because the devotees would have to come here to learn about Prabhupada's personal association with the people here, his family, his godbrothers, his friends. So Satsvarup Maharaj, after having collected so many memoirs of the devotees who took part in these activities, he was then able to compile objectively the pastimes of Srila Prabhupada. But then later, some very valuable books were written. This is a book written by Mukunda Das Goswami, Miracle on 2nd Avenue, and this is a subjective rendering of those very same pastimes, where we can understand the mental, the psychological, and the spiritual development of his disciples as they're speaking personally in their books. So we have, because Mukunda, he was one of the first of the disciples, he describes what Satsvarup Maharaj describes in the Lilamrita according to how he sees everything. So we'll compare the two things today. This is from the Lilamrita we're reading from. He sat before the mound of earth, that's Srila Prabhupada, looking out at his congregation. They appeared not much different from any other group of young hippies from the Lower East Side, who might have assembled at any number of happenings, spiritual, cultural, musical, or whatever. Some were just checking out a new scene. Some were deeply devoted to the Swami, but everyone was curious. He had requested them to chant the harekrishna mantra softly throughout the ceremony, and the chanting had now become a continual drone, accompanying his mysterious movements as head priest of the Vedic rite. So this might have been the very first Agnihotra that was ever performed in America. And these fortunate young men and women, they were getting to watch Srila Prabhupada. They had never seen anything like it. And they were also taking part by chanting Hare Krishna. So this is a usual practice. Anytime we have a sacrifice, the devotees chant Hare Krishna. We would chant on our beads, or there would be kirtan going on softly. But Prabhupada had not yet instituted japa. No one knew about japa yet. This is going to be the first time that the devotees are given beads. In fact, they had to make their own beads, because there were no beads in America. He began by lighting a dozen sticks of incense. Then he performed purification with water. Taking a spoon in his left hand, he put 3 drops of water from a goblet into his right and sipped the water. He repeated the procedure 3 times. So that means the devotees were very intently watching everything that Srila Prabhupada was doing. How many times he did it, how many drops. It was the first time they had ever seen anything like this. The 4th time he did not sip, but flicked the water onto the floor behind him. He then passed the spoon and goblet around for the initiates who tried to copy what they had seen. When some of them placed the water in the wrong hand or sipped in the wrong way, Swamiji patiently corrected them. Now, he said, repeat after me. And he had them repeat, one word at a time, a Vedic mantra for purification. We can all repeat it together. Om apavitra pavitrova sarvavastam gatopi va ya smaret pandarikaksham sa bhayabhyantara suchihi Shri Vishnu Shri Vishnu Shri Vishnu. Now, how many of you remember chanting this when you were getting initiated? You? I don't. We're just following what we were told to do, most of us. The initiates tried falteringly to follow his pronunciation of the words, which they had never heard before. Then he gave the translation. Unpurified or purified, or even having passed through all situations, one who remembers the lotus-eyed Supreme Personality of Godhead is cleansed within and without. So Prabhupada was initiating by the Pancharatriki Vidhi, and this was not according to the Smarta Brahmins, not according to the Shruti system. This is according to the Vaishnav system. And that means anyone who chants Hare Krishna and observes the principles becomes qualified to accept the initiation into the chanting of the holy name. 3 times he repeated the sipping of water, the drone of the Hare Krishna mantra filling the room, as the goblet passed from initiate to initiate and back again to him. And 3 times he led the chanting of the mantra, Om Apavitra. Then he raised a hand, and as the buzzing of the chanting trailed off into silence, he began his lecture. So I've copied here a portion of the lecture. So because it's very important, this is the first time Prabhupada is introducing this initiation process, so we can understand how he's establishing this very new process within ISKCON. The Swami continued with the word-for-word chant for about 1 minute, and then explained its meaning. This is coming from Mukunda Goswami's book. Apavitra means unclean, and pavitra means clean. So anyone who may be unclean or clean, it doesn't matter. In whatever condition one may be, either unclean or clean, if that person remembers Krishna who has lotus eyes, that person immediately becomes cleansed, internally and externally. Now I will explain the meaning of this initiation ceremony. This initiation means purification. We are all impure in this material world, and therefore birth, death, old age, and disease have overcome us. So in order to overcome these miseries, we must voluntarily accept some tapasya, some sacrifice, some rules and regulations. Why do we need to accept the spiritual master? To accept the spiritual master is not a hobby. One who is interested in hearing about the transcendental subject matter, Ramante Yogina Anante, the unlimited, infinite subject matter, for him a spiritual master is needed, not for all. So we must accept a spiritual master who can teach us about God. And who is such a person? That also is stated in the Upanishads. It is said, Shrotriyam Brahmanishtam. The spiritual master must come down in disciplic succession, and as a result of such authorized succession, must be fully, firmly convinced in Brahman. And the student must surrender himself to the spiritual master for instruction. Why? Because spiritual master is representative of God. A spiritual master is supposed to spread God consciousness, Krishna consciousness, make everyone Krishna conscious. The disciples should respect the spiritual master as much as God himself, because he is the most confidential servant of God. Not that the spiritual master is God, no, but he is to be respected as such, because he gives us the words of the disciplic succession, the words of God. So Srila Prabhupada, he was speaking this to the initiates and also to the curious, the interested visitors that day. And there had been a misconception by something that Prabhupada had said a few days earlier, that the devotees didn't understand, that the spiritual master should be taken as God. So now here he's clarifying that the spiritual master is as good as God, because he's the Supreme Lord's representative who comes to teach us about God. After the lecture, he asked the devotees one by one to hand him their beads, and he began chanting on them. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. The sound of everyone chanting filled the room. After finishing one strand, he would summon the owner of the beads and hold the beads up while demonstrating how to chant. Then he would announce the initiate's spiritual name, and the disciple would take back the beads, bow to the floor, and recite Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti-Vedanta Swamin Iti Namine. So later, as Srila Prabhupada accepted more and more disciples, he didn't necessarily chant one round while the disciple was sitting there. He would chant on the beads beforehand, so the beads would already be sanctified. And when the disciple was called up to receive his name and his beads, at that time the beads would be delivered to the disciple along with the name. After Wali received his beads, Wali was the first to receive the beads, and his new name, Umapati, he returned to his place beside Howard and said, "That was wonderful. Getting your beads is wonderful." In turn, each initiate received his beads and his spiritual name. Howard became Hayagriva, Wali became Umapati, Bill became Rabindra Sarup, Carl became Karlapati, James became Jagannath, Mike became Mukunda, Jan became Janaki, Roy became Rairam, and Stanley became Stradish. Another Stanley, a Brooklyn boy with a job, and Janos, a college student from Montreal, both of whom had rather peripheral relationships with the Swami, appeared that night and took initiation with the rest, receiving the names Satyavrata and Janardhan. So, unfortunately, sometimes we meet people who claim to be disciples of Srila Prabhupada. Now we have a database of the disciples of Srila Prabhupada, so we can always checklist if it's true or not. I often have devotees coming and telling me, my name is such and such, I'm a disciple of Srila Prabhupada. I just wait until I go home and I check on the database. That's all. So we also have people who claim to be the first female disciple of Srila Prabhupada, and they advertise themselves as such and get a lot of world renown. So here we have, in truth, who the first female disciple of Srila Prabhupada is, and that was Janaki, Jan. And each one of these disciples, they played very pivotal roles in establishing Krishna consciousness in these early days. If we were just like in a drama, each of them played their part, and they were very important for assisting Srila Prabhupada. We know that Michael Grant, he was the one who found 26 Second Avenue, and he supported Srila Prabhupada while Prabhupada was at the Bowery. Prabhupada stayed with him when he had to leave. His girlfriend, who he 2 days later married, Jan, she was right there by his side, always assisting Prabhupada, learning how to cook from him. James Green was the one of the teachers at a college, carpenter teacher. He didn't feel qualified, but Prabhupada asked him to come to the initiation, so why not? Raymond Marais, he was an editor of a comic book, so he had some publishing experience. Later, Prabhupada made him the editor of the Back to Godhead magazine, which just a month later, Prabhupada will be establishing in America. Carl also met Prabhupada at the Bowery. He was just lived a few houses down from Prabhupada, and he was very interested in Prabhupada's teachings. The only problem was that his wife was antagonistic. She saw Srila Prabhupada as a threat to their new marriage. So he was very much torn between the two, his material life and his aspirations for spiritual life. But when he heard that Prabhupada was giving initiation, he also came. Howard met Prabhupada just walking on the street one day. He had just come back from India, and he told his friends. His friend here was Umapati, Wally. They lived together. Kirtanananda, that was Keith. So he also brought many devotees. He was a professor in Michigan of English literature. So he played a very pivotal role in editing Prabhupada's manuscripts, because we know there are all different kinds of English. Today one mother came to me and said, I want my daughter to learn American English, but in school they teach them Indian English. What should I do? I said, well, the only way that you can learn it is if you're living with American people, then she'll learn American English. So Prabhupada's English was Victorian, because he grew up at the time of Queen Victoria. So his writings were, even my own family members, I would say, yes, we're getting trained up. Trained up? That's very Victorian. So there's some phrases in the English that Srila Prabhupada would put into his books that Howard would more or less Americanize. Sometimes he went overboard. When he was talking about, Prabhupada would be writing about herding the cows, and Howard, because in America you don't herd cows, you herd cattle, because they have huge cattle farms for the meat farms. So he changed it from cow to cattle, and Prabhupada had to change it back. So sometimes there was a misunderstanding, but Prabhupada was right on top of all of it. He would make sure that the editing was done correctly. Robert Lefkowitz, we don't know much about him. Wally, of course, we just heard about his initiation. Stanley, we heard about his faux pas, the mistake that he made with Mr. Bogart, and Prabhupada sent him back to his mother for some time. When he asked for some gasoline to commit suicide, he wanted to set himself on fire because he felt that he had displeased Prabhupada so much. So Prabhupada gave him a little rest, sent him back to mommy, and when he became a little less crazy, he came back and he was there for the initiation. Then the other Stanley and Janos, Janos later went to Montreal and opened the third temple of ISKCON. And Prabhupada, when he had to get a new visa, he went there and stayed in Montreal for some time. So Janos or Janardhan, he was also very instrumental in assisting Srila Prabhupada. We'll hear about him later. Then Swami began the sacrifice by sprinkling the colored dyes across the mound of earth before him. With fixed attention, his congregation watched each mysterious move as he picked up the twigs and wooden splinters, dipped them into clarified butter, lit them in a candle flame, and built a small fire in the center of the mound. He mixed sesame seeds, barley, and clarified butter in a bowl, and then passed the mixture around. Each new disciple took a handful of the mixture to offer into the fire. He then began to recite Sanskrit prayers, asking everyone please to repeat them, each prayer ending with the responsive chanting of the word Svaha 3 times. And with Svaha, the initiates would toss some of the sesame barley mixture into the fire. Swamiji kept pouring butter, piling up wood, and chanting more prayers until the mound was blazing. The prayers kept coming, and the butter kept pouring, and the fire got larger, and the room got hotter. Prabhupada, he made sure that all the windows were kept closed because of the neighbors. So there was a lot of smoke in the room. After 15 or 20 minutes, he asked each of the initiates to place a banana in the fire. With 11 bananas heaped on the fire, the flames began to die, and the smoke thickened. A few of the initiates got up and ran coughing into the other room, and the guests retreated into the hallway. But Swamiji went on pouring the remaining butter and seeds into the fire. This kind of smoke does not disturb, he said. Other smoke disturbs, but this kind of smoke does not. Even though everyone's eyes were watering with irritation, he asked that the windows remain closed. So most of the smoke was contained within the apartment, and no neighbors complained. So this pouring of the ghee into the fire, that's Agni Dev. He's eating the ghee. And this is how the Khandava forest was burned up. Because one king had performed so many yagyas with so many hundreds of kilos of ghee, and Agni Dev had eaten all that ghee in the fire, and he got indigestion. And he had to have some herbs to clear his stomach. And the herbs were within the Khandava forest. And that was why he wanted to burn up the Khandava forest so he could eat those herbs. So this is all beyond our comprehension, but we're getting just a little first taste of how Prabhupada was introducing these Vedic principles into the Western culture. Swamiji smiled broadly, rose from his seat before the sacrificial fire, the blazing tongue of Vishnu, and began clapping his hands and chanting Hare Krishna, placing one foot before the other and swaying from side to side. He began to dance before the fire. His disciples joined him in dancing and chanting, and the smoke abated. He had each disciple touch his beads to the feet of Lord Chaitanya in the Panchatattva picture on the table, and finally he allowed the windows opened. As the ceremony was finishing and the air in the apartment was clearing, Swamiji began to laugh. There was so much smoke, I thought they might have to call the fire brigade. Prabhupada was happy. He arranged the prasadam be distributed to all the devotees and guests. The fire, the prayers, the vows, and everyone chanting Hare Krishna had all created an auspicious atmosphere. Things were going forward. Now there were initiated devotees in the Western world. Finally, most of the disciples went home to their apartments, leaving their spiritual master to clean up after the initiation ceremony. So we have to remember that, you notice Keith's name wasn't in the list, although he was one of the earliest of Prabhupada's followers. And we had explained that Keith was actually in the Bellevue Mental Hospital during the initiation because he had attempted to get some money for the temple from the welfare department. And when he told them that God told him to go there, they called up the mental institute and said, there's somebody here who talks to God, come and get him. So he missed the first initiation. But just 2 weeks after this, Keith, and Satsvarup also, he voluntarily did not come to the initiation. Instead, he spent the whole evening typing Prabhupada's manuscripts. He felt he wasn't quite ready to fully surrender his life to Krishna. But 2 weeks later, he was ready. Achyutananda, he was on a holiday. He had taken a week's break from all of the chanting and dancing and classes, so he missed the whole thing. He also was initiated. And Brahmananda had only been coming for a week. It was all quite new to him. He was looking for a spiritual master, but it was a little too soon, so 2 weeks later he was ready. Prabhupada did all of this by himself. Keith was his only helper at the time, so he didn't have Keith to help him. He set the whole thing up by himself. September 10th. The morning after the initiation, Prabhupada sat in his apartment, reading from a commentary on the Srimad Bhagavatam. The large Sanskrit volume lay before him on his desk as he read. He wore horn-rimmed glasses, which changed his demeanor, making him look extremely scholarly. He wore eyeglasses only for reading, and this added to the visual impression that he had now gone into a deep professorial meditation. The room was quiet, and brilliant mid-morning sunlight shone warmly through the window. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. Yes, come in. He looked up, removing his glasses. As Mike and Jan, now Mukunda and Janaki, opened the door, peering in. He had asked to see them. Yes, yes, come in, he smiled, and they walked in and closed the door behind them. Two vivacious young Americans. From his expressive eyes, he seemed to be amused. They sat down before him, and Prabhupada playfully addressed them by their new initiated names. Who remembers their names? Mike and Jan. Right. So, you are living together, but now you have taken serious vows of initiation. So what will you do about it? Prabhupada had tricked them. He had tricked they didn't know what the four regulative principles were until after the initiation ceremony. Then Prabhupada told them. Well, Mukunda seemed puzzled. Isn't there any love in Krishna consciousness? Swamiji nodded. Yes. So I am saying, why don't you get married? They agreed it was a good idea, and Prabhupada immediately scheduled a wedding date for 2 days later. Swamiji said he would cook a big feast and hold the marriage ceremony in his apartment, and he asked Mukunda and Janaki to invite their relatives. The relatives were 3,000 miles away in Oregon, and they had 2 days to get here. Both Mukunda and Janaki had grown up in Oregon, and their family members found it impossible to travel such a long distance on such short notice. Only Janaki's sister, Joan, agreed to come. Okay, so we're going to divert a little bit. We're going to hear how Mukunda describes all of this in his book. I thought a lot about the Swami's position on celibacy and marriage in respect to my and Jan's relationship. Apart from one sharp look the first time he visited our loft, he never directly indicated any disapproval of our live-in status. Nevertheless, now that I was attending his lectures more regularly, it was becoming more and more apparent to me that our living together out of wedlock didn't fit with the culture the Swami embodied. Finally, the day after the peace vigil, I got up the nerve to ask Jan to marry me. She looked shocked and then pleased. "This is so unexpected," she said. "Why are you asking me now? I thought things were going okay just the way they are." "Well, sure, but we've been together for a while, and it seems like the right thing to do now if we're going to live by what the Swamiji's saying. It kind of seems from his lectures that you either have to be married or be celibate." "Yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about it like that." "We could ask the Swami to marry us." "Yeah, we could. That would be far out." "Yeah, I thought that if he married us, our marriage would be kind of like blessed or something. Like I thought having him do it would make it lasting and permanent." "Look, Michael, this is all kind of sudden. I can see where you're coming from, but I need a bit of time to think." Of course, they had been living together for months now, and she had to think about it. "I kind of like the way things are now, and I think I'd like it to stay the same as it has been the last year or so." I wasn't overly encouraged by this initial response, but the following day she said yes. "The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I actually wanted to get married," she said. "If it's what you still want, that is." "It is. That's great, Jan," I exclaimed. That afternoon, I asked the Swami if he would consider performing our ceremony, even though I had no idea what a Vedic wedding ceremony included. He looked pleased when I told him Jan and I wanted to get married. "Yes, I will do," he said. "We will have it here." He gestured around the main room of his apartment, which had remained almost empty despite his having lived there for several weeks. "Maybe in 2 weeks?" he asked. "That sounds fine." "What do I need to do for the wedding? Should I invite people?" "Yes, of course, your families and friends." "What should we wear? Does the bride wear white?" "No. Bridegroom should wear white." That means the man should wear white. "Bride wears red." "Red?" "Yes, red sari. Maybe you can purchase somewhere in New York. I don't know, but she should wear red." After trolling through the yellow pages, I managed to locate an Indian store named Sona, the Golden One, in Manhattan's East 50s. There I was able to purchase Jan a Banarsi sari of rich deep silk, its borders embroidered with gold thread. When the store proprietor figured out the sari was for a wedding, he tried to sell me a set of heavy gold jewelry, hair ornaments, hand chains with rings for every finger, red and gold bangles, ornate earrings with shiny red stones. But knowing Jan's understated taste, I settled on a small pair of gold earrings. On the way home, I bought myself a simple white dress shirt and a pair of white slacks. So this is how Mukunda describes how the marriage took place. Then there's what we just heard today. Wait a minute. Okay. Now enter a new personality who we all have heard of, Joan. Later she would become Jamuna. Joan. So Joan is speaking here. Little did I know what kind of wedding it would be. All I knew was that they had met a Swami and were taking Sanskrit from him, as well as attending his small storefront temple on 2nd Avenue. When I met the Swami, he was sitting beside the window in his front room, bathed in sunlight, surrounded by pots of prasadam, which he was distributing to the devotees who were sitting around him against the wall. I was a follower of macrobiotics, and not so eager for taking this noonday meal. When I entered the room, the Swami said, "Who is this?" And Mukunda said, "This is Janaki's sister, Joan. She has come from Oregon to attend the wedding." Swamiji said, "Oh, where is Oregon?" Mukunda said, "It's 3,000 miles away, on the other side of the United States." And he asked, "Oh, coming from so far. Very nice. And when will the other members of the family arrive?" Then I said, Joan said, "I am the only one who is coming for the wedding, Swamiji." He said, "Never mind. It is very nice that you have come." So we had heard about macrobiotics when we read about the Paradox Restaurant. Remember with Bill Epstein, he was the waiter there. And macrobiotics is a very bland diet, no dairy whatsoever. They eat primarily, because this was a big fad at this time in the 60s. I also did it, especially in Oregon. They were macrobiotic. So this is where Joan was coming from. They eat brown rice, they eat seaweed, they eat vegetables, and that's about it. Very bland. So when Joan saw what the Swamiji was serving out, it was like breaking the 10 commandments of macrobiotic for her. She was not interested. "Please sit down and take some Krishna prasadam." He offered me some dal, a rather moist sabji, yogurt, salad, and chapatis. But because I was a devotee of macrobiotics, all of this prasadam was very unpalatable to me. Practically speaking, it was sticking in my throat the whole time. But I remember looking over at the radiant and beautiful person who was so eager for me to take this prasadam that he had prepared. So I took it all. But in my mind, I decided this would be the last time I would take this luncheon with the devotees. Of course, we know that Jamuna became the greatest cook in ISKCON. This is how she got initiated. At any rate, somehow I finished the meal, and Swamiji, who had been looking over at me, said, "You want more? You want more?" And I said, "No, thank you. I'm so full. It was very nice, but I can't take any more." So finally the prasadam was finished, and they were all getting up to clean. And Swamiji commented that he wanted to see Mukunda, Janaki, and myself for making preparations for the wedding the next day. So when we were all there sitting in the room with him, the Swami reached over into the corner where there was a big pot with crystallized sugar syrup. Now, sugar is like for us taking meat, fish, and eggs. You don't take sugar if you're macrobiotic. You can take rice bran syrup. Rice bran syrup is their idea of a sweetener. I thought, oh, this is supposed to be the piece de resistance, that's French. That means the one thing that you have to resist. But I can't possibly take any more. But he reached his hand into the pot anyway and pulled up a huge, round, dripping gulab jamun. I said, "Oh no, I'm so full, I couldn't take any." And he said, "Oh, take." And he made me hold out my hand and take it. Well, by the time I finished the gulab jamun, I was fully convinced that this would be the last time I would ever come there. But it worked. ISKCON bullet. So we can hear what... The day after our initiation, Janaki's sister Joan flew in from Oregon for our wedding. She was the only member of either of our families to attend. On the day of the wedding, Janaki and a handful of others decorated the Swami's apartment with ornaments made of leaves which were strung from the upper corners of the room. As they decorated, the Swami moved around the kitchen preparing our wedding feast, and he had Joan, his sole assistant, busily engaged in rolling and folding potato pastries. Okay, so now we'll read what... There she is in the kitchen. Then he began explaining how in the Vedic tradition, the woman's side of the family made lavish arrangements for the wedding. And since I was the only member of the family who had come to assist, I should come the next day and help him make the wedding feast. So the next morning at 9, while Janaki was decorating the room for the fire sacrifice, stringing leaves and flower garlands across the top of the room, I went upstairs to meet Swamiji. When I arrived, he immediately sent me out shopping with a list, 5 or 6 items to purchase. One of those items was not available anywhere in the markets, although I spoke to so many shopkeepers. When I came back, he asked me, "You have obtained all the items on the list?" And I said, "Well, everything except for one." He said, "What is that?" I said, "Well, no one knows what tumor is." It might have been turmeric. He had me wash my hands and sat me down in his front room on the floor with a 5-pound bag of flour. 5 pounds is about 3 kilos of flour. A pound of butter and a pitcher of water. And he looked down at me and said, "Can you make a medium soft dough?" I replied, "Do you mean a pastry or pie crust or short crust dough or pâte de brise dough? What kind of pastry do you want?" "How old are you?" he said. And I said, "I am 25, Swamiji." "You are 25, he said, "and you can't make a medium soft dough?" It is a custom in India that any young girl from the age of 5 years is very experienced in making this dough. But never mind, I will show you. So he very deftly emptied the bag of flour and with his fingertips cut in the butter until the mixture had a consistency of coarse meal. So one wonderful devotee, Bal Gopal Devi Dasi, she was cooking for Prabhupada in Rome. And of course, Prabhupada, he would teach particular devotees, like when he taught Joan, and then Joan, it was her responsibility to teach other devotees. So because they had just opened this new temple in Rome, Prabhupada had come there, and she was going to cook for him. So he told her to make the medium soft dough. And he gave an example what medium soft dough is. And he took his earlobe. He said like this. This is how soft it should be. So this is what medium soft dough is. In case you ever have to make kachoris. Then he made a well in the center of the flour, poured in just the right amount of water, and very deftly and expertly kneaded it into a velvety, smooth, medium soft dough. He then brought in a tray of cooked potatoes, mashed them with his fingertips, and began to sprinkle in spices. He showed me how to make and form potato kachoris, which are fried Indian pastries with spiced potato filling. From 11 until 5 that afternoon, I sat in this one room making potato kachoris. Meanwhile, in the course of the same afternoon, Swamiji brought in 15 other special vegetarian dishes, each one in a large enough quantity for 40 persons. And he had made them single-handedly in his small, narrow kitchen. So we know that Prabhupada, one of his childhood names was Kachori Mukhi. And he would demand kachoris from his mother. Prabhupada loved kachoris, all different kinds. So here Prabhupada is teaching her potato kachoris. Now, in India, they don't measure. They can tell, it's a magic. They know just how much water to put in, just how much butter, everything. So when Prabhupada had me learn how to cook from his sister, we had no mixie, we had nothing. The only thing we had in the kitchen was the sealed butter. And that's how we would grind things. Otherwise, we just had our fingers. So you see here, Prabhupada, he did everything with his fingers. They didn't have the flour mixer. They didn't have the other mixer. They didn't have for making mashed potatoes. Everything by hand. And when you use your hands, you can, just like when we eat with our hands, there's something, it helps the digestion. So when you cook with your hands, you learn how to understand ratios of things without measurements. But you'll see, when Jamuna made her masterpiece cookbook, everything has measurements in it. So what they did was, because she learned everything here in India just by watching, she transformed that for the Western mindset, which is we have to know, 1 1/4 or 1 1/2 and how many teaspoons, because that's the way they're taught in the West. So they tested everything and they put it into ratios, either the English system or the American system. You can see in the book, it's, you can transform it according to which type of English and which type of measurements you use. Because in America, everything is different from the rest of the world. They have to be different. So they use ounces and gallons and things that nobody's ever heard of in the rest of the world. Everybody else uses metric system, but not in America. So she had to do it both ways. So she took that training that she got from Prabhupada just by watching. Prabhupada, he would say that an intelligent person learns just by observing. So we would learn how to cook just by watching. And then later she transformed that into that award-winning cookbook, The Joys of Indian Vegetarian Cooking, that became world famous. Now, when Prabhupada had me make kachoris, he told me a trick, because sometimes you have to make a lot of kachoris, like what Joan had to do, and you can't fry them all at the same time, and they can't all be ready at the same time. So he said that you can half fry them, and then you can store them, and when you're ready to serve them, then you fry them a second time so that they're nice and hot and crispy when you're serving them. It was rather hot that afternoon, and I was perspiring. I asked, "Swamiji, may I please have a glass of water?" He peeked his head around the door and said, "Go wash your hands." I immediately did so, and when I returned, Swamiji had a glass of water for me. He explained to me that while preparing this food for offering to the Supreme Lord, one should not think of eating or drinking anything. Excuse me. So after drinking the glass of water, I went in and washed my hands and sat down. About 2 p.m, I said, "Swamiji, may I have a cigarette?" and he peeked his head around the corner and said, "Go wash your hands." So I did, and when I came back, he explained to me the 4 rules of Krishna consciousness. I continued to make the kachoris, and around 3:30, 4 o'clock, it was extremely warm in the room, and as Swamiji was bringing in one of his preparations, I was wiping my arm and hand across my forehead. He looked down at me and said, "Please go and wash your hands." And again I did so, and upon returning, he had a moistened paper towel for me. He explained that cooking for Krishna required certain standards of cleanliness and purity that were different than the ones I was accustomed to. So one time, we were cooking for Prabhupada here, and I was assisting his sister, Pishima, and Pishima, such an expert cook, everything, she just knew everything. But when the lunch prasadam was brought in, Prabhupada found a hair in one of the preparations. So he sent a message that 3 things you have to be very careful when you're cooking. Hair, the dirt from your eyes, and I believe it was the dirt under your fingernails. So when we cook, if we've learned properly, we know that anytime we even touch our body, we should wash our hands. And this was the first principle that Prabhupada was teaching Jamuna. If she would touch anything, even if she would, before she would drink the water, and then after she would drink the water, if she touched her head, if we touch our clothes, we always have to wash our hands before we recommence our cooking. So at this stage, this is the first day really that Joan had met Prabhupada, he was already teaching her how to cook. About 30 people attended. The decorations were similar to the ones for the initiation a few days before, except they were more festive and the feast was more lavish. Swamiji's front room was decorated with pine boughs and leaves, and flowers were strung overhead from one side of the room to the other. Some of the new initiates came, their large red beads around their necks. They had taken vows now, 16 rounds a day, and they chanted on their beads just as Swamiji had shown them. And they happily, though self-consciously, called one another by their new spiritual names. So in these early days, the devotees wore their big big beads around their necks. But Prabhupada had brought with him a pattern to make bead bags. Prabhupada had a bead bag. He would chant with the bead bag, but he had not yet taught the devotees how to make the bead bags. And at some point, Prabhupada was going to take out, it was cardboard, it looked like a lotus with 4 petals. And that pattern we copied in all the temples, and that was how we made our bead bags. When I got initiated and married, I made a bead bag for Prabhupada and sent it to him as a gift. So this was something new that we were learning about. Now, not only do we have beads, but now we have to keep our beads clean by keeping them in the bead bag. But at this point, they did not yet have bead bags. Janaki. Swamiji said that I should wear a sari at my wedding, and he said it should be made of silk. I asked him what color, and he said red. So Mukunda bought me an absolutely elegant sari and some very nice jewelry. The Swami's friends were used to seeing Janaki, as she always came with Mukunda, but usually she wore no makeup and dressed in very plain clothes. They were astounded and somewhat embarrassed to see her enter wearing jewelry, makeup, and a bright red sari. The bride's hair was up and braided, decorated with an oval silver filigree hair ornament. She wore heavy silver earrings, which Mukunda had purchased from an expensive Indian import shop on Fifth Avenue, and silver bracelets. So, yes. So now we have 2 minutes. I'm just going to read a little bit how Mukunda and Jan were experiencing this marriage ceremony. Finally, Janaki and I were sitting before the Swami for the second time that week, this time dressed in our wedding clothes and garlanded with fresh flowers. Crammed into the small room were the 18 friends we had invited. In front of the Swami were a now familiar mound of soil and a bowl of ghee. Janaki looked dazzling in her red sari. So, I am very happy that Mukunda and Janaki are today being married, the Swami said. Actually, I am a sannyasi, retired from married life. It is not the business of sannyasi to take part in marriage ceremony, but in this country, just to save my students from sinful activities, I am personally taking interest. I see that here in New York, most of the boys and girls, they are keeping the boyfriend and girlfriend. So I am requesting all my students that if you want to make progress in spiritual life, you have to refrain from 4 kinds of sinful activities. Illicit sex life first, second, non-vegetarian diet, third, intoxication, fourth, gambling. Unless one is free from these 4 principal activities, one cannot make progress in spiritual life. According to our Vaishnava principles, marriage is allowed because there is male, there is female. Why they should not unite? This is proper. The Swami turned his attention from the audience toward us. I request that you live happily together, he said. Please do everything in relationship with Krishna. Live a pure life and be happy in this life and next life. Now you all please chant Hare Krishna. So now they're going to have the fire sacrifice, and we'll continue next week. Hare Krishna.